Okay, do you have a good picture? Well, they'll tell me if they don't, because they can talk.
Back and forth, yes.
Okay, so
Okay.
mute yourselves now and.
Well, good evening. 4 weeks is not enough time to cover everything, but we're going to do our best to fill in some of the stuff that I haven't talked about. I wanted to start off with, I had mentioned this last week. The Bread organization, which this congregation belongs to, you know about the meetings and so forth. Well, the ministers used to meet all the time. Once a month we get together and we have various conversations, and sometimes one of us was asked to write a theological reflection on what we were doing. And, you know, we were very diverse clergy, priests, ministers, rabbis, and imam at the time when I was here. So we had a great variety. And so one time we had a retreat for about 2.5 days at a retreat center. And the idea was to do some more of the spiritual work, looking at texts together. And of course, picking text was difficult because not everyone, like for instance, the Jews, were not particularly interested in having something from the New Testament, and so on and so forth. But everyone gave, and they didn't try to bother anybody as much as it was possible. So I was asked to do a paper on Jeremiah. And I said to the head of the organization, I said, you know, that's not my field of expertise. I said, my field of expertise is the New Testament. I used to teach it at seminary. I want to do something about Jesus as a prophet. He said, okay. And so I'm going to read some. This is from a paper that I gave to my UU colleagues at a retreat, a study group that I belong to and have belonged to since I first moved here, and which was very important in my own spiritual development as I went through the years. So my fears about the controversy of a UU minister giving a paper on Jesus increased on the night before I gave my paper. The local AME Zion minister, who I've come to really like, asked me as we were going around introducing ourselves, like you do on an opening evening. He said, in front of everybody else, I honestly don't know a thing about it, he said, and I know that you're openly gay, so it must rather be different from my own tradition. Well, that's an announcement on his part. And nobody batted an eye, I will say that. There was no noise or anything like that. Yeah, I knew that. So I answered in the best I could. When, however, I made it clear that while we UUs might read the Western scriptures in services now and then, or more rarely, frequently, in some Eastern New England churches, we rarely appeal to them as some divinely inspired authority. And that's when I saw eyebrows go up. I could suddenly tell he realized how different we were in our religious culture from his own. And on the next day, he knew this unorthodox gay man was going to be giving a paper based on a text from Matthew, which the UU tradition, unlike the AME Zion tradition did not live as an example of God's very word. And thus, though the conversation was quite cordial and certainly informative for everyone, I sense that at least a few of the Christian clergy who did know something about the Unitarian Universalist tradition were growing a tad anxious about me reading the paper the next day. The rabbis and the cantors, of course, were mostly at ease. I wondered if some of them were afraid I might actually present as fact some of the wildly unorthodox theories that have found some currency even amongst Unitarian Universalists, such as those found in Hugh Shainfield's The Passover Plot, Dowling's Aquarian Gospel, all the bloodline of Jesus theories so popular in the last 20 years, and even the supposedly humanist theories offered in the Prometheus Press book, Robert Schaeffer's The Making of the Messiah, which is crammed with research, put quotation marks on both sides of the word, approaches that would ordinarily mortify any press concerned for its scholarly reputation. Or worse, the articles which purport to prove, again, with quotation marks on both sides, that Jesus never existed at all historically, by making claims that would even make the aggravating charlatan who wrote the Chariots of the Gods blush. And yes, all of these interpretations would certainly justly discussed by esteemed AME Zion colleague and many others as well, including myself. Gladly, I don't think any of my interfaith colleagues had even suspected that in my 40-year study of the Gospels, I've gone way beyond that very short list and have read with critical eyes even the most wildly crackpot interpretations of Jesus in my attempt to approach the Gospels openly. I'm sure none of them suspected that I actually deigned to read John Allegro's truly eye-crossing book, proclaiming that Jesus was merely a code word for the hallucinogenic effects of the fly agaric mushroom, or that I had allowed myself to read Barbara Thiering's barren and bewildering suggestion that Jesus was a deranged Essene entrepreneur who survived a staged crucifixion, got well due to Essene medical expertise, and got married as often as possible thereafter. Furthermore, I researched the Essene Gospel of Peace, a text much admired in my former home of Berkeley, California, which quoted, quote, "The earth is our mother," teachings of a mystical Jesus. To my surprise, I researched the book and found out that it had been written by the grandson of a Unitarian bishop from Transylvania. Nor did they suspect, my colleagues, that I had read all of the colorful and slant novels of the last 100 years, like King Jesus by Robert Graves, who basically said that Jesus was the actual son of Herod the Great. The Lord Jesus by Robert Payne, The Gospel of Corax by Paul Park, Shalom Ashes, The Nazarene, Michael Moorcock's sci-fi punch in the face, Behold the Man, it's about a man who goes back to look for the historical Jesus via a time machine, which crashes, and he ends up becoming Jesus. Amazing. Punch in the nose. And I also read The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, his Manichaean Reverie, and even the Urantia book, which, though not technically a novel, is novelistic in its depiction of the life of Jesus. So if any of my colleagues, amongst my Christian colleagues, suspected any such indiscriminate attitude on my part, their teeth would have been grinding quite understandably in anticipatory order. Of course, there were a lot of you people who wrote about Jesus, like Jacob Trent, who wrote a book called The Word to Jesus, Reverend Don Robinson's very scholarly Jesus, the Son of Joseph, and even Sophia Fawes, one of our great religious educators, Jesus, the carpenter's son, somewhere along the line. So maybe they wouldn't flinch too much if they knew about those. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know that I read everything outside scholarly theory. Personally consider it all bunk. But I have read it. So I'm going to read a poem. And one of the things about both the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures is that you find poetry embedded in there. Now, sometimes when you look at a book of poetry, poetry is clearly marked out. Here's a poem, here's a poem, here's a poem. Some of the poetry that's found in the Greek scriptures, for instance, like the famous passage about love, love is patient, love is kind, found in Paul, is not separated from the rest of the text. It's not identified as a poem. It sounds like it when it's read at the wedding, but it's not organized that way by the publishers. The only place that you find poetry so-called in the Hebrew scriptures is the book of Tehillim, the Psalms, which basically means songs. That's what psalm means. It's a Greek word for song. So the most famous one that people know is the one that people know it from the King James Version. Many people can recite it because they've heard it at memorial services and so forth. Here's a translation that's closer to the Hebrew. Adonai Rayu no Esau. The eternal shepherds me. I lack for nothing. He makes me lie in meadows green. He leads me to refreshing streams and revives life within me. He guides me by true paths, as he himself is true. My road may run through a glen of gloom, but I fear no gloom. For you are beside me. Your club, your staff, they give me courage. You are my host, spreading a feast before me, while my foes have to look on. You have anointed me for a purpose. My cup is brimming over. Yes, and all through my life, your servants, goodness and kindness will wait on me. Be the eternal's guest within your household all of my days. Doesn't say everlasting like in the King James Version. Translation is an interesting thing. You can take the same Hebrew words, and if a Hebrew poet who knows Hebrew well, ancient Hebrew, modern Hebrew doesn't count. Ancient Hebrew is very different. But if you know somebody who's a poet and you look at those words, their translations are all going to be different. For instance, the beginning, Adonai Roi. There's no verb there. it's not used in that particular place. The Lord is my shepherd. There's no, well, all the things that we have in English, Hebrew doesn't have those things the same way. So people will translate things into other languages, and it's going to come across a little bit. My grandmother was a shepherd, so I know something about what a shepherd is like. And she would have told you that, and I think I mentioned this once before, the reason I don't use the word pastor for myself, which means shepherd, is because the shepherd is not leading the sheep. The sheep lead the shepherd, and the club and the staff are there to protect the sheep from wolves and predators, and that's it.
Oh, wait.
It's not a guidepost for the sheep to follow or anything like that. And that's because we're urban people who are not shepherds, and there's no reason why we would know that. So there's no problem with that. But again, when you're looking from a modern city with tall buildings, and you're looking at passages that are set in a very different pastoral setting, there's more than just word translation that is involved. There's whole cultural translation, which can't be necessarily put in a translation. You can try to add a word or two to help situate it, but you have to be pretty damn clever to do that and be still faithful to the text that you receive. So translation is a very difficult thing, both for the Greek scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures. I'm going to give you an example of that because I want to talk a little bit about Paul, who people love to hate. And Paul was real serious translation problems with Paul. And part of it is because the English translations that are available to us come from the English Reformation, and they were trying to make a point in their translations. For instance, the Bishop's Bible, which is one of the earliest English translations, which precedes the King James Version, used to have notes, marginal notes, like modern day Bibles often do, to explain this, to explain that, to help the reader understand all of these cultural notions. When King James promoted this new translation, he refused for there to be notes. The reason is because the notes in the Geneva Bible were kind of anti-royal. They found all sorts of ways to denigrate the whole idea of kingship, which is, there's a lot of criticism in the Hebrew scriptures, for instance, against the power of royalty. And so he said, no, let just people read what's there. And the translation wasn't really much of a translation. It was basically a revision of the Bishop's Bible. And as Dan McClellan is pointing out all the time, it was a very conservative translation. And it wasn't very popular until the 19th century. It was read in Anglican churches, but it wasn't popular enough just for people to read on their own. Nobody said, oh, the language is so beautiful. What they said is, we don't understand this. All these words are old-fashioned and have been out of use for 200 years. And why did they use them? You know, because English has changed a great deal. So I'm going to read some things about translation. So this is a book called The Authentic Letters of Paul. Well, there's 12 letters of Paul found in the Greek scriptures. Only about 6.5 of them are actual authentic letters of Paul. And even the ones that we do have interpolations that were added later. For instance, Paul said that in the anointed one, translated usually as Christ, in the anointed one there is neither male nor female, nor slave nor free. All of the dualities don't exist in the unity of the anointed one. It's a very modern radical statement. And it doesn't fit at all with interpolations which were put in there later, and where people actually wrote letters in Paul's name that Paul never wrote, which denigrate women and say that women should not be leaders in churches. Those are all added later. That's not the actual St. Paul. And this compendium in the back of this book, I found it most extraordinary. Let's see. So the anointed, or God's anointed, which in Greek is Christos. In English, it's Christ. The term Christos is a translation of the Hebrew term Mashiach, and refers to one who is appointed and empowered by God to carry out a special task, just like in the psalm we just heard. The fact that the person had oil on their head was anointed meant that they're being set aside to a special task. If you just read it straight from the King James Version, you poured oil on my head, you're not going to get that. Confidence, confident trust in God. As a translation for the Greek pistis, the traditional translation for that is faith. By this term, Paul does not mean intellectual assent to a theological proposition such as I believe in Christ, I believe in heaven, I believe in that there is salvation of some sort. It's not what faith means. It's an attitude of trust and confidence. Confidence is a really fine word. Reliance, corrupting seduction of power. That's used in letters they're translated. This is a glossary explaining why these letters sound so different than the ones read in church, which were designed to be read in church, not to be a faithful reproduction of Paul, but to support Protestant ideas that are already there, such as salvation by faith alone, interpreted as belief. Corrupting seduction of power, the Greek hamartia. The traditional translation is sin. Usually the mythic sense of the word hamartia is overlooked in translation. For Paul, hamartia is a personified force that enters and obstructs the human story. It is more than a single act or specific actions, aka, oh, that's a sin. Rather refers to a fated condition that gains momentum over time. I'm not going to do all of these because it's a lengthy thing. Gathering the anointed people, the anointed community. Greek, ecclesia, traditional translation, church. The Greek term ecclesia refers to an assembly or a gathering. And specifically, if you look at the Greek, ecclesia is related to the English word klaxon, like horn. You're being called out by a musical instrument into community, a temporary community, a temporary city council to deal with a problem in the city. That's where the word comes from. It's an assembly, and they're called out to join together to do something together. And in Greek politics, it was basically an ad hoc city council because they didn't have elections in the way that we do. If there was a problem to be solved, the klaxon went around, the voice went around calling people of intelligence and wealth to come to an assembly place to solve a specific problem. So it's a very different idea than people hear the word church. All kinds of images come to their mind. But the word ecclesia had a very specific meaning in ancient times, and it's changed now over the years. God's presence and power. The Greek is pneuma or pneuma hagion. Traditional translation, spirit or Holy Spirit. These terms refer primarily to Paul's sense of the presence and power of God in his own experience and that of his converts. The translation is also informed by the fact that the Spirit of God in the Hebrew Bible invariably refers to morally defined power that is effective in directing Israel's life in history. Later, in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, Christian theologians came to regard the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. To this ontological concept, Paul would be anachronistic and wouldn't like it at all. God's world-changing news or message. Greek, euangelia. Traditional translation, gospel. The term evangelion occurs only 3 times in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And while the related word euangelizomai occurs in 3 different passages in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah and in a few other texts, it appears that Paul's frequent use of the word as the term for the message he proclaimed 46 times in his letters was most likely influenced not by these infrequent biblical occurrences, but by its use in inscriptions all around him whenever he traveled around. Goodness knows Paul was on a boat a lot of the time, traveling hither, thither, and yon. Inscriptions found about in the Roman period. The Pyrene inscription, for example, uses the word evangelion in reference to the news of the world-changing achievements of Caesar Augustus. Paul used evangelion, evangelical is the modern translation, in an analogous way to refer to the world-changing news of what God had done through Jesus, God's anointed. So there's a political, once again, political association with the word gospel, good news, world-changing news. So I can go through all of this, but this is worth getting if you're interested in St. Paul. I'll put this up on the board, the authentic letters of Paul. It's by a whole bunch of authors. You just put the title in, you'll find the book. Anyway, the other thing about Paul is that the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke, whoever that was, Luke, but we don't actually know, also wrote a book called The Acts of the Apostles. And the problem in looking at St. Paul's letters and then looking at the book of Acts is they appear to be talking about two entirely different people. John Dominic Crossan, and you can go on YouTube and just put John Dominic Crossan and Paul, and you'll find him giving talks about, he also has a book that he wrote that's quite excellent. He basically says there was a great conflict in the early ecclesiae, communities, assemblies that were forming throughout the Roman Empire about who Paul was. And he even points out that he says Luke, in all of the Greek scriptures, was the greatest storyteller. Whenever he tells a story, it's memorable. So he tells the story of the conversion of Paul. You know, he's on a horse, he's going up to Damascus. He sees a great big light that makes him blind, makes him fall off his horse. That's a very dramatic thing. Never happened. It's actually a satire on the part of Luke about Paul saying, I saw the Lord, I saw Jesus. Because he specifically says he was blind there. He didn't see anything. And so, and all the stories in the book of Acts, you know, some of them have, they touch on certain historical things. Yeah, he traveled around a lot and so forth. But it's a way of moving geographically. If you follow the book of Acts, he's always moving more and more close to Rome, which Luke wants to make as the center of things. No longer Jerusalem, but Rome. And the actual geography presented in the Acts of the Apostles says that. Now, Paul talks about his own experience of seeing the Lord. He talks about it in third person. I knew a man in the spirit of the anointed one who was hauled up to the third heaven, talking about a mystical experience, using the language available to him, and saying that he had this great mystical experience where he experienced Jesus. Did he see Jesus or claim to see Jesus as a person walking around in a body? No. But he claims to have seen Jesus in a mystical way, and that makes him an envoy, an apostle, because Peter and the other apostles also claim to have seen Jesus. But what did they see? You know, the word see has a pretty clear, concrete meaning to most of us. If I look out here and see you, I can describe what you're wearing. I can talk about the colors of your sweaters. I can talk about the color of your hair. I can talk about what your nose looks like. I can see. So the ordinary meaning of the word see, I understand it makes the whole thing about resurrection difficult. But Paul says very clearly in his letters that he is a Pharisee. That is a kind of Jew, a Jew in a particular denomination, we would use in the modern word, I guess. He wasn't a Sadducee, he wasn't a priest in the temple. He wasn't a revolutionary, a zealotist, a zealot. He was a Pharisee. And the Pharisees were people that developed around 150 years before Jesus. And they were religious liberals. not conservative. They were religious liberals, and their basis of trying to live their lives was based on the fact that they were trying to understand basically why the Jews have had such bad luck, if God is a good God. Every 15 minutes, there's an empire coming and conquering them throughout the last 500 years. The Persians, Alexander, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, running over their land, and God is supposed to be their protector, their mainstay, and God's falling down on the job. And people are dying. People are dying horrible deaths. They're being executed. By the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands in all of these wars. So they're having an existential problem like many modern people. They weren't that different from us. People who tell me I don't believe in God because they're suffering and God doesn't lift a single finger to help suffering, so calling God good doesn't make any sense to me. God ignores us. Therefore, there is no God. All the people who say God is good and then say, well, God does whatever God does. That's why I'm an atheist. Understandably so. So they tried to come up with a solution. And their solution was that people who died were martyrs. They were glorified by God in some way, and that they would come back. They would be resurrected, which would make things okay again. If you have your head lopped off and your head is put back on, you're alive again. Oh, you can have bread and wine and grapes and artichokes, and you can still live a good life. You can make love. So the idea of resurrection was always an idea that was a general resurrection. So when the early Christians first started to talk about anastasis, resurrection, the first thing they posited was that Jesus was glorified. After he died, here's this man that they loved and was doing good things, and a political machinery killed him. Once again, God seems to be missing. So they talked about him ascending. They describe it very stupidly as about him going up in the air. But the original stuff that we read was that they basically said he was vindicated. Vindicated by God. That's what the word ascended meant. And they expected that Jesus's resurrection was the beginning of the general resurrection that the Pharisees had long taught. And the Gospel of Matthew even says, well, when Jesus died, a lot of people came out of their grave. At the time he was crucified, graves were opened and people walked on. People actually saw them walking through the streets of the city. It's not a passage read too often in church on Easter Sunday, which tries to preserve the uniqueness of what happened to Jesus. And Paul was a Pharisee and did not believe in the uniqueness of Jesus, but the leadership of Jesus. He was beginning a great change. And that change would happen very soon. And if you start taking these things literally, you forget, for instance, that every night at the synagogue on Friday night, Jews still pray. May it be soon. But the redemption of the world and the Kaddish. It's a hopeful statement. It's not a literal statement. And it's been literalized. Human beings are kind of hopeless as far as I'm concerned about literalizing things. But it was basically saying, it's coming, and Paul thought that. I don't think Jesus thought that. I don't think Jesus ever said he was going to come back. I don't think Jesus predicted the end of the world or anything like that. I think that was put into the Gospels later on to make it harmonize with Christian theology as it developed. But Paul certainly thought that he needed to offer his world-changing message, the gospel, which is that the violence of Rome was going to be superseded. Jesus wasn't the only one crucified. They were crucified by the tens of thousands, and 50% of the Roman Empire were slaves. It was a violent empire. It was based on violence. It was supported by violence. It was kept as an empire by violence. And what, Jesus was critical of the violence in all of the parables that he told. Paul, as a Pharisee, actually said violence can come to an end. There can be an institutional change. And as Crossan once put it, what Paul was basically saying to the early people who eventually were called Christians, they weren't called Christians very early. You're not going down on the Titanic. You're the iceberg to break the destruction, to end it. It's an interesting metaphor, but I like it. So that's a brief understanding of how the resurrection story started off, and then later on, because of people wanting something literal, the stories start to appear about him walking around, eating some honeycomb, and having conversations with people, and walking through walls. But Paul, when he talks about resurrection in his authentic letters, goes out of his way to say, that's stupid. What a ridiculous idea to think that a body is going to come back literally as a regular human body. It's going to be a spiritualized body, a body of light, a pneumatic body is the word we used. It's not going to be this body, because this body, as we know, corrupts eventually. So it needs to be made of something else, not this kind of flesh.
I also heard that in the Mark's gospel, that the last portion was added. It was original version was that they discovered a stone was turned and
That's correct.
But after that, the version that we read has other things. Could you explain about that? Maybe?
Yeah, the Gospel of Mark, the oldest gospel, written probably around 71. I used to say this on Sunday whenever I would read a biblical reading. I always give the date because I found that to be very, very important to recognize that. I gave the date for all readings, but the biblical readings too. Notice I said Mark service 71. Mark ends his gospel at verse 8. Talks about the women going to the tomb, seeing a young man, not an angel, seeing a young man there. And they go away afraid. The young man says, he's not here. He's gone before you into Galilee. So that's a geographical thing. So when the other gospels portray Jesus as appearing around Jerusalem, they're contradicting Mark, because he said he's back in Galilee. Well, what was in Galilee? Their families, their fishing routes, their real lives. It's a very powerful statement. It's basically saying, if you want to look for the risen Christ, don't look for razzle dazzle. Go back and live your lives in a Christ-like way. and make Christ alive again in your life. It's a very different attitude of resurrection. And because later Christians couldn't stand the fact that it ended that way, there were 3 different editions that were added. And many modern translations don't put them in. They just say, no, we understand that these were editions, they'll put them in an appendix in the back and say, well, these were written 100 years after we died. For once again. Yeah, and when the resurrection stories are told by the 4 Gospels, it's pretty screwball when you look at them across the board. Mark talks about a young man. Matthew talks about an angel. Luke talks about 2 young men. And John talks about 2 angels. So you see kind of like a geometric progression here without having to be math experts or anything. You can just obviously see that the story is growing and growing back and forth, people all telling stories. This is what I heard. I heard this. And it's kind of like when I told you last week that the passion stories, which are equally screwball in the sense that they don't fit each other at all. When I said that they were made up, I don't mean cunningly to fool people. Please don't get that idea in your head. They were people trying to figure out what must have happened if God abandoned this wonderful man. There must be something that went on that gives us some hope. And so they reinvent a Pontius Pilate, who's actually a weak man, easily buffeted around. By this time, the temple has been destroyed. The Romans are not too happy with the Judeans for having had them bring out their military in such great force, including a division all the way from Spain, to come in and fight this war that the Judeans were in rebellion against Rome. So the Jews who lived, the Judeans who lived in other parts of the Roman Empire, Alexandria and Rome, Athens, they were Jewish neighborhoods in all these places, and they were Hellenized. The Jews generally spoke Greek. They read the Nomos, not the Torah, the Greek translation of the Torah. And so many of these were people who were part of these Christian assemblies before they were called Christian. They were simply assemblies where the Hebrew scriptures were read, stories of Jesus were told. There were no written gospels, and handwriting a gospel is going to take you an awful long time on the parchment. Handwriting a couple hundred of them is going to take you nearly forever. So it's not like people had access to these stories in written form very early. They probably were not circulated till 150, and only assemblies that had enough money to pay for an expensive thing like a papyrus scroll that had some of these things on it. It wasn't easy. We're so spoiled by our phones. I can talk to my friends in St. Petersburg, Russia on my phone right now with no problem. So what did the early assemblies do? They did evening meals. They were always in the evening. They were supper clubs. Supper clubs were common in Roman and Hellenistic culture. You gathered in small groups, small because you were not meeting in great big meeting houses, you were meeting in somebody's house, usually somebody rich enough to have a big enough house to seat 20 people around their triclinium, their eating table. And these things happened in the evening. The stories were told, hymns were sung very early. We have records of early texts of hymns. We have no melodies that have survived that we know of. And they ate a meal together. And by meal, I don't mean bread and wine. I mean supper clubs, many courses, food to fill the belly. It is nourishing, and it's a Roman and Greek custom. It was not invented by the Jews who followed the Anointed One. It was their culture. And little by little, the ritual developed. The earliest record we have of the Eucharist, communion supper, is from the Didache, which dates to about the year 100. And it does not mention anything about this is my body and this is my blood. There is bread, there is wine, that we're blessed. And we think that at the supper club meals, bread and wine were singled out, and there were specific blessings made over the bread and the wine. And based upon the stories of the Last Supper that we now have, it wasn't even done like together. In the middle of the meal, there was the breaking of bread, and toward the end, there was wine. They were connected. And what were they saying? Well, as far as we can tell, if the stories of the Last Supper found in Paul and also in the Gospels are telling some aspect of the truth, here's what I think what was being said. The Gospels describe the last meal of Jesus as a Passover Seder. Whether it was or not, I can't say. There's reasons to think it was, and there's reasons to think it's not. The three synoptic Gospels insist it was a Seder. The Gospel of John insists it was not a Seder. So we have some disagreement early on. Second of all, the word body was the word used during the Passover ceremony colloquially to refer to the lamb. And it was just a colloquial phrase, the body. And so if Jesus at some Passover meal said, this is what I mean by body, breaking this fellowship around this table. This is the real freedom. This is the real Passover, this community. We don't need to sacrifice animals anymore. We have each other. And with wine saying, this is the blood of the covenant. Not killing a sheep and eating it, but drinking wine together. Conviviality is a nice English term about that. Being in community together as a way of countering the violence of the larger world. You hear people saying the same damn thing right now. If you're online, I see it every single day. Not using the words body and blood, but saying community is the most important thing now because we're surrounded by violence on all sides. And the only thing that's going to save us is community. It's going to get us through. So that's one interpretation. The idea that Jesus was predicting his own death, as I said, doesn't make any sense to me. He wasn't God with a vision of the future. He could have guessed that he was being a troublemaker and that might certainly have come to pass for what he was doing. When he went into the temple, supposedly the week before he died, John says it was early in his career that John changes everything. But if indeed the synoptics are correct, that he went into the temple, people have all kinds of opinions about that event and how it can be interpreted. But the money changers were not cheats. That's an anti-Semitic interpretation, which I hear in churches all the time. That the money changers had their thumbs on the scale and were cheating people, whereas in actuality, all this stuff in the ancient world that we have talking about this refer to the money changers as being really honest. And like surprisingly so, because everybody else was cheating about everything. So they had a reputation for being very honest. So the interpretation that he was flipping over tables because they were those damn cheating, money loving Jews is a complete ridiculous statement and anti-Semitic in its very basis. The Jews and their money. So what may have happened? Well, if you look at the temple, there was a temple, a building, and there were a courtyard around it. Courtyard here, all colonnades. A courtyard here, a gate here, some gates here. Another courtyard here. And then an entrance, a raised platform. And then around the whole thing was a fence. Around the whole center thing was a fence. We actually have archaeological evidence of the fence. We have found some of the placards that were on that fence. So we know that when Josephus is describing the temple in architectural detail, that he's not just making this up. On this wall, there were placards. I'm sorry, here, this wall. There were placards that said, if you are not circumcised, meaning if you're not Jewish, if you're not circumcised and you're found on the other side of this wall, you alone are responsible for your own death, which will happen immediately. No messing around. No Gentile was allowed to go beyond this fence. Now the Gentiles here, they could do anything they wanted here, but here there was an opening, and the money changers were here. This building here was called the Basilica, and in the entire first century of Rome, Roman Empire, this was the largest building ever built. It was magnificent. This huge colonnaded building with painted roof and colored. There was a lot of color in the temple. It wasn't like a Greek, but the Greek temples were full of color too. The Parthenon was painted green and red. So, you know, people could go anywhere, but only Jews could go here in the center. This was the court of the women, and then there was the court of the priests, and who could watch the sacrifices on the altar. And there were slaughtering tables, and there were great big bowls for purification full of water. So if the tables are here, the way the story is told, Jesus quotes Jeremiah. my house is a house of prayer for all people. And the word that's used means everybody, all nations, including Gentiles, non-Jews. But you have made it a hideout for crooks. Not referring to the priests in the sense of their religious role or anything like that. He was referring to the fact that the temple was the main economic center of Jerusalem. And the wealthy, the oligarchs, the priests were all oligarchs. They found archaeological evidence of their houses. They were beautiful. They were filled with mosaics and paintings and things like that. They were on a nice high suburban hill with views. He was basically saying that the devotional side of the temple has been lost. The fact that this is a place for spiritual growth and development, and instead it's become the great banking center. Not because there's cheating going on here, but he says, my house is a house of prayer for all people. So what does Jesus do? He goes here, and the imagination that he went in there violently and kicked tables over doesn't say that. It says he overturned the tables. I'm suggesting that he overturned the tables to break open the wall. Just took a table, brought it over. It wasn't kicking ass. To break the wall between all the nations and the Judeans. So he's doing something that's a radical prophetic thing, like all of the ancient Hebrew prophets did. They did things like this. Jeremiah took a pot and broke it with a hammer as a symbol of destruction. So the same thing is true of Jesus, who did prophetic things, symbolic things. So that's why I don't think it was violent, because if it was violent, he would have been arrested immediately. He caused a commotion, but the Roman fortress was right here. The Antonia was right here. They were being launched all the time. So if this had been a violent thing, they would have come down immediately and arrested him. But he made sure it was not a wild, violent thing. So it got, things got added to it. John says he had a whip and so forth. That's all added later. And people trying to interpret after anti-Semitism had taken over the gospel writers. Because the gospel writers are filled with anti-Semitism. Those damn Jews are always up to something, and the whole gospels are written like that. And most liberal Christian churches will say that when they're doing the gospel reading on Sunday. They acknowledge that. You're not going to find that in the evangelical church. You're going to find the anti-Semitism. I've heard it. It's awful. So at the end of the week, there's a supper, and then Jesus is killed. Jesus is described as somebody who can do all kinds of magic tricks. So, for instance, there's a story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. Jesus goes to Bethsaida. That's a Hebrew word that means fisherman's wharf, by the lake. Goes to Bethsaida, and the townspeople come out of the town and bring him a man who is of lepo. He can't see. It's a more modern translation is blind. But What you don't realize is ablepo in Greek medically meant me, because I'm nearsighted. It meant somebody with cataracts. It meant somebody who was born blind and had no eyes at all, or had, eyes that didn't work. It was a much broader term than our word blind. It says that Jesus was, the townspeople brought this guy out because Jesus was famous as a healer. It's an interesting story. Whether this is historical or not doesn't make any difference to me, because it's describing the culture of the time. Jesus does a prophetic act. He takes saliva and places it on his eyes and puts his hands on them. Doesn't say exactly what that means. Could be anything from a hug to literally just placing his hands on his head or on his eyes. But he anoints his eyes with saliva. Well, it sounds strange, but isn't it interesting that the emperor Vespasian, also healed a man by putting saliva on his eyes? It was a medical procedure. So he asked the guy, "Can you see?" He says, "I see trees, but the trees look like they're walking and confusing them with people." So Jesus repeats it, repeats the action. And finally, Jesus says to him, "Look hard." And then it says, "You can see." And then Jesus says to him, "Don't go back to the town where the people are that you came from. Abandon your town and your family." Well, that's a peculiar statement. Well, he's basically saying that he identified as being a blepo, and he was supported by his whole family and clan, but he was a blepo. There was a psychological dimension to it. So he says, if you don't want to return to your blindness, you better not go back. That's a very interesting story. Whether it's historical or not, but it's a very interesting story. First of all, it shows that Jesus is not doing magic tricks. He has to do this twice to get some effect going. Could he heal? Well, I've done healing before. I have been healed before in ways that were not done by a doctor. I had a woman when I had crooked my neck so bad for 4 days I couldn't turn my head other way. It felt like a knife in here. And I was in a class, the start came. It was break time and I was grabbing my stuff to go. And this classmate said to me, "Why are you taking your notepads and you're going to be looking at it?" I said, "I can't take the pain anymore. I'm going to go to Kaiser. I need to be treated," because I said, "I can't move. I've been in pain for 4 days." She said, "Well, let me try something first." I said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I've had a massage." Didn't do anything. He said, "I was in the bathtub for a long time with hot water. I tried ice. What are you going to do?" She said, "Let me try." He said, "Lay down on the floor." I said, "Okay." And then 5 minutes later, it's not going to make that much difference. She sits on my butt basically and then uses her fingers to read my back like it was braille. She's gone back and forth like this with both hands. No pressure. I could just feel her fingers going back and forth. And then she said, "Okay, there's heat here," and she taps something, and there's heat here, and she taps something, and then further down, she said, "There's some heat here. I'm just going to welcome you, but not make you had pain. So she rubbed them a little bit. Just a little bit. Okay, so she does this. She says, sit there for a minute. Then she says, get up. I get up. Okay. Not one bit. Not one bit. I tried to make it come back by turning my head wildly, and it was gone. Can I explain that? No, I can't. But I'm telling you, she did something. And I don't know what it was. As a minister, many times somebody has come in very, very distressed. And we talked, and I gave a hug at the end. And their life is better. They tell me that. Something happened. They learned to do something different with their life than they had been, and they feel freer. Is that a miracle? It's a wonder that it happens. But that's all the words in the Bible. The word miracle is not really there. The words are things like wonderful event, amazing event, paradoxa. You need to read a translation for that, a paradox. Those are the words that are used. And there's attributed miracles to Jesus, paradoxa. He's out in the wilderness. There's 5,000 people. Pay attention to the numbers. 5,000 people. His students come up to him and say, you know, we're going to get hungry. Babbling all day, talking about this and that, and it's late at night, and it's time for them to go home. And they have to eat. He said, why don't you get this? He said, what did we have? Something. What are you talking about? So one of the, there's a little boy here who's got 5 loaves in a basket. He says, bring them here. And he breaks them. And he passes it out, and everyone has enough to eat. And then they collect 12 baskets afterward. So numbers. 5, 12. Well, the only 5 that there is in the Hebrew scriptures that is a significant 5 is the Torah. The first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures. Summarized by Jesus. When asked about what does the Torah teach, he said, you know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There's 12 baskets left over of crumbs. So the author of Mark, in telling the story, is being sarcastic because the only number 12 that exists in the Greek scriptures are the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples. So what he's basically saying, he's being critical of some of the development of the early church, saying that Jesus preached that love one another, be there for each other, just like Hillel, the great rabbi, had said. That's all you need. That's the Torah. Everything else is just commentary. But you apostles, I just fed everybody with just that. And your apostles think that you have something else to say. It's just promise. It doesn't feed anybody. The Gospel of Mark is very critical of the apostles. So is it a miracle story or a parable invented by Mark? I would suggest the latter. And he tells the story the same way. Again, he talks about 7 loaves feeding 4,000. Well, the 7 loaves refer to the 7 Noahide laws. What the Jews said, if you're a Gentile, you don't have to follow the 10 Commandments, but there's these 7 laws that you should be following to be a moral human being. And again, there's 7 baskets left over, which is the satire on the fact that the early church had 7 deacons who were not doing anything good to pass the teachings of Jesus on. So the Gospel of Mark is very sarcastic. People read it devotion. I went over, but I'm just going to keep on going down if you don't mind. I'm going to conclude by reading some of the wisdom literature. There's a whole section in the Hebrew scriptures. It's called the wisdom literature, and it includes the Psalms. It includes a series of love poems called Shir HaSharim, or the Song of Songs, which doesn't mention God once. It is basically Jewish poetry about lovemaking between two people. The images are a little pastoral for us. You read them and you think, well, kind of a strange image, but it worked well in those days. And in the Hebrew, there's some rhyme and meter and some of the things we associate with poetry. And they fought for years whether to put that in the Bible or not. Both the rabbis and the Christians, when they were finally nailing everything down. But go read it. There's an interesting, wonderful translation made of the Song of Songs by a lesbian who treats it as 2 women together. So there's a lot of things that can be done interpretively with the books that we've received. This is from Ecclesiastes, called Kohelet in Hebrew. This is the best translation I've ever seen. It's by Rabbi Rami Shapiro. So if you want to read more of this, I would recommend that. Everything is beautiful in its own moment, but the ripening is hidden from your mind, and you have no way to comprehend beginnings or endings. From this, I concluded it's best for you to rejoice in what is and devote your life to goodness. This is the gift of reality. Eat and drink and find work that pleasures your heart. Reality's flow is endless, moment to moment. Nothing is added and nothing is taken away. And its sole purpose is to open you to wonder. Whenever I've read from the book of Kohelet in services, people will come to me and say, that's not the right book. I'll say, yeah, well. Sorry, you were raised in the church that never read it. So here's my guidance and the right path. Eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with gladness. Let your clothes be clean white. Let your head never lack for oil. Find a beloved with whom to share your life, no matter how long or short your life is, because this is what makes your life and your labor worthwhile. Whatever falls into your hand to do, do it without hesitation. For in the grave, there is neither doing, nor reason, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. So the wisdom literature, and this really is I'm going to recommend this as not only the best translation, but the most poetic translation And he gives, at the beginning, a whole essay about why he translated every single thing that he translated. So he's not just asking you to have confidence in him as a translator. He is proving himself by saying, this is what I mean by this. You'll find in most translations of the scriptures in Bibles that the word God is in this book. He doesn't have it once. The reason he doesn't is because the use in Hebrew of the phrase that is translated as God is unique to this book. It says, Ha Elohim, the God. That is not a reference to anything else in the Hebrew scriptures. It's a brand new phrase. And it's a way that, the way he looks at it after having researched that particular phrase, he simply says the best translation in English is the word reality. From the way that the verbs follow from it, the verbs precede it, and so forth. So you'll find the word reality in here, as opposed to saying the God. The other thing he recognizes is that the translations that exist in the KJV and many of the traditional translations are all sexist. And he undermines that whole translation and says, this is why it was made sexist and it's not in the Hebrew. It's because the people who were translating this thing wanted women to keep their place. And so they made it that way. But he denies that that's in Hebrew, and he explains why, point to point to point. So it's really worth getting as a separate volume. You could order Ecclesiastes by Ramon Shapiro. So I hope that you'll do that, because it's a beautiful book. And I read from it many times in services because it almost sounds Buddhist. When you read through it, you kind of think, wow. The beginning of Ecclesiastes in the King James says, vanity of vanities, everything is a vanity. The beginning of this, and again, he explains why he translates it this way. Emptying upon emptying, said the assembler. Emptying upon emptying. Everything is emptying. A lifetime of labor under the sun. And what survives? The earth outlasts you. Humanity passes away one generation after another. The sun rises only to set, and then races breathless to the place of rising once again. The wind spins without end, and the moment southward, one moment southward, and the next moment northward. All rivers empty into the sea, yet the sea never fills. Indeed, the waters rise and return to the river's mouth that they may flow yet again. Talk exhausts us, and eventually we fall silent. Yet the eye never tires of seeing, nor the ear of listening. I think that's just beautiful. And in general, the wisdom literature is like this in the Hebrew scriptures. It doesn't resemble the history books. It doesn't resemble the fairy tales and the other stories. It is philosophical. And, even in the Psalms, you'll find philosophical poetry in many cases. Or in the Song of Songs, you find love poetry, which is sufficient unto itself. it doesn't need to mean anything else. So if you haven't read that, take your Bible sometime and read them. Now, once again, it's books that are not read on Sunday morning.
Proverbs as well.
And Proverbs also. And Proverbs, it's treated by the, since the Protestant Reformation, the Bible is the source of everything, source of authority. So when people look at the book of Proverbs, Mikveh, they're thinking these Proverbs are all useful. The fact is that they are an anthology collected of Proverbs from all over the Middle East and are not necessarily meant for you to follow all of these Proverbs or take them seriously for yourself. You should read them and choose them. It's simply a collection. And some of these things were not written by Hebrew people, but they were from local countries. The word proverb is used in all of these countries. My grandmother spoke rhyming Italian proverbs all the time, and they all rhyme in Italian. So remember, and there's a lot of these things that are also memorable when you hear them in Hebrew. They have meter, memorable ways of saying things, but in English, they're. So again, if the Bible is the source of all wisdom, and there's some crap in Proverbs, too, some awful things in Proverbs. But when you beat your child, don't draw too much blood. Not a good one. But it wasn't some person who sat down and wrote all these things, as in the case of Ecclesiastes. It was a collector who brought all of these wisdom statements together for you to decide what made sense to you.
I've always heard it was attributed to Solomon writing them.
Yeah, attributing books to authors was an ordinary thing to do. Nowadays, if you plagiarize or claim that somebody wrote something, you do. But back in those days, like the people, like the author of First Timothy is not St. Paul. We don't know who it is, but they claim to be St. Paul. And that was something that was done more often in the ancient world than it is now, that you could claim to be somebody. As far as we know, Solomon wrote nothing. And most of the story of Solomon is all political stuff anyway, but has nothing much to do with literature. When they call him wise and stuff like that, it was all to make a political point, meaningful at the time, not terribly meaningful for us today. Because he wasn't the first one, so they had to. In those days, the firstborn was the one who became the king. But David's children kept on killing each other, so it wasn't really that. Sorry I didn't give you a break. I just was in the zone.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head around who Jesus thought he was. I mean, do you think he was kind of an itinerant rabbi who was saying that Israel become corrupt by the rich and the systemic rituals and needed to go back to the old ways? Or did he think that God was going to come down, make everything right, put him in charge?
I don't think the second one at all. I don't think that there's evidence for that. And you can read Dominic Crossan's book on Jesus, the historical Jesus, who will explain that in great detail. He'll answer that question over a period of 50 pages as to why the apocalyptic view that Jesus was himself deranged enough to think the world was going to end somehow because of him is simply not true. And I think he was, somebody who was born of a woman whose father he didn't know, who was a menzer, that means a bastard, who was not respected by people. His mother was ridiculed. And got off to a bad start. But he clearly was smart. And he observed the reality, like I mentioned early on. When he was a kid, he saw a forest of crucified bodies along the road outside of Damascus after the revolution of Yehuda the Galilean. So he knew that the world was a violent place. And he observed this and apparently wanted to do something about it. Many people who are ridiculed as kids, shamed and stuff like that, don't want anyone else to be hurt. And they do what they can to prevent that. And Jesus eventually became very political about it, an organization, and recognized there were so many things that got in the way. Was he divine? No. Was he perfect? Absolutely not. But I think he was a very, very right man who was reacting to a political situation and an economic situation at the time, which he invited people by telling them stories to get them involved. He was asking them to question what they had been taught, asking them to question not what they had been taught by religious leaders necessarily, but what they had been taught by the social network about how you're supposed to behave economically. And I think over time, so many layers were added to that the tragic loss of this guy, when the students saw that he had just yanked away and crucified, helps for me to explain why they would deal with it, you know, with the idea of a resurrection, a vindication. But I don't think he expected a vindication. I don't think he expected. Yeah, I don't think he saw the future at all. Because he was an ordinary human being.
What always struck me that the thing in the Bible where he gets left out forsaken, it seemed to me like he didn't get like why am I dying?
Well, the reason that that's put in his mouth, and I'm going to tell you what was put in his mouth, is because that's Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 has some words that in the English translations and in some Hebrew translations could conceivably refer to a killed man who was then vindicated at the end. You know, the King James Version in Psalm 22 is, they pierced my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. It's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, it's like a lion bite in my hands. Very clearly, not a nail or anything like that. But people have taken the Psalm 22 to say that he was fulfilling prophecies. And the early Christians, after a while, in a way to try to understand why this man that had been so important to him was yanked away from him so suddenly, tried to find that he was predicted something. They would look at the Hebrew scriptures and say, oh, that kind of sounds like Jesus. No, it doesn't, but they forced and bent words to make it seem like it referred to some little aspect of Jesus. And this was common very early on. Gospel writers all try and do it. They even quote things from the Hebrew scriptures that we can't even find. We don't know what they were quoting, but they say, as it was written. So they had to be a different version or something, but they were trying to justify that what happened was God's purpose from the very beginning. And that Jesus was simply fulfilling a destiny for the sake of humankind. That he was a martyr, like the Maccabean martyrs, is something that the early Christians went with. And then he put the idea of the exaltation, the ascension, and then finally the idea of resurrection amongst the Pharisees. It became a huge vindication of his validity as a prophet, as a teacher. So, and I understand why it happened. I don't think anyone was in there being duplicitous or saying, how can we cunningly trick people? And I've heard things like this in the past. I've heard some really crazy things. The Romans invented Jesus completely, made up the whole story as a way of accomplishing some object of their part. The idea that people wrote books that have mistakes and grammatical mistakes totally is ridiculous. So, and the Greek is not terribly good, some of the Gospels. The best Greek is Luke's, but the rest of the Gospels are written kind of this, that, these, them, and those. Nothing elegant, played out. Could also. So.
You said the book's the story of Jesus.
The book is called The Historical Jesus, and it's by Crossan, and it's not something you're going to read in less than 2 months. It's huge, and he doesn't baby anybody. He uses. You might have to look at a few Greek words here and there because he's not going to translate them all. But he's really. I never met anyone so brilliant as John Dominic Crossan. Every time I've ever heard him speak, and when I spoke with him myself, I was stupefied that he has all of this in his head, and can pick up historical facts and then archaeological stuff. It's just amazing. I'm keeping you over. Bye. Have a good evening. I have to talk to somebody in the lab.
I don't have
It's like that's really the last, it's 4:30.